And again, welcome everyone. Today we are talking about the art of the interview. And what I love about this is Dalton has attended Radically Rural a couple of different years, and he's been a speaker for us with our interactive songwriting session. And in our survey that follows the summit, we always ask, is there something you'd like to bring to the table for our network? Because we might think that X, Y, or Z is important, but not realize that there's other things percolating in the background with our network. In a couple of years, Dalton said, I really want to talk about the art of the interview and how it can impact the work and personal lives of folks, regardless of what industry that they work in. And so we're very excited to finally be able to make this happen. It's very much about eliciting story and how to do that and how to use that in your work and personal life. And for some of you who are journalists or bloggers, interviewing is obviously a part of your everyday life. For others, it may surprise you how different aspects of the interview may pop into the work and in your life. So we're very happy to have Emily Lytle and Dalton Zbierski to be here with us today. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves and get things rolling. So I'll let Emily go first and then Dalton.
Thanks, Juliana. It's great to see you all. Thanks so much for joining. So my name is Emily. I work with the innovation team here at the Reynolds Journalism Institute, which is based at the University of Missouri. What that means. So I work with news organizations across the country to test new ideas, new tools, new technology, anything that's going to help journalists do their job or better serve their communities. I collaborate with them to test those things out, and then we write about it and share it with the greater industry on RJI's website, as well as on the Innovation in Focus newsletter. So that's kind of a little bit about what I do, and I'm excited to talk to you all about interviewing and kind of hear what thoughts you have too.
Absolutely. And my name is Dalton Zbierski. I'm the editor of two papers in Western Massachusetts. They are the Chicopee Register and the Wilbraham Hamden Times. They're both in different environments. The Wilbraham Hamden Times is two smaller towns in Western Massachusetts, and Chicopee is a city of about 55,000 people. I really enjoy getting out there and talking to different people in all walks of life, covering things from municipal government to the schools, to people doing outstanding stuff in the community. And it's really, interesting to speak to different people every day. And that is definitely my favorite part of the job. And I look forward to meeting all of you.
Awesome. So as we get started, before we kind of dive in, what we wanted to do was to kind of poll the crowd and see what your experience with interviewing has been like, because we know there's probably some journalists in the room and there's probably some non-journalists in the room. So I think Lillian is going to set up a poll, and I believe you'll be able to give more than one answer if more than one applies to you. But if you could respond to that, and then that'll kind of give us a benchmark to go off of.
Great, I can see them rolling in. Thank you, guys. All right, that looks like about everyone. So we have high percentages, equal percentages of folks who are journalists and interview people often and who have been interviewed. And then we have 4 people who have only been interviewed for a job situation and 1 person who has never participated in any kind of interview.
All right, great. Oh, cool. We can see that now.
You should be able to see them. Yeah. Cool.
Great. All right, that is super helpful. So hopefully we can talk about things that will be applicable to everyone and share ideas. We want to hear your ideas too. So the first thing we're going to do, we want to get you thinking and practicing. So we are going to go out and break out groups, and we're going to do a little bit of an interview practice. So what we're going to do is each person in your group is going to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about your story. So tell us who you are and what your connection to radically rural is, or what your connection to rural communities are, or journalism, if that's more of your connection, I guess. So kind of hit those two main points. And then after you do that, someone in your group will ask you a follow-up question to what you said, and then they will go and share their story. So we will help you kind of see what that looks like. Dalton and I can kind of show you. So if I was going to go in my group, I would say, hey, everyone, my name is Emily Lytle. I am the Innovation in Focus editor at RJI. My connection to rural communities. So I grew up on a farm and in a more rural area. So it's kind of something that has always been a part of my life. And then when I worked as a reporter in Delaware, I often covered more rural communities and things ranging from farmland preservation to hospital and healthcare access, to development and environmental issues. So it's something that I'm passionate about, especially the access to journalism in rural communities. And then Dalton can ask me a follow-up question.
Yeah, definitely. What do you think the most unique aspect was of growing up in that environment? Because I grew up in a similar environment out in Connecticut. I live in Connecticut. So I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about, that environment you grew up in.
Yeah. So I grew up in an area that was like semi-rural. Like you had grocery stores within 15 minutes, but maybe to go to the mall, you go 30, 45 minutes, if that puts it in context. But growing up on a farm, I think you learn like certain lessons as a farm kid that you don't always learn if you don't grow up on a farm, like circle of life type things, but also about like the hard work that goes into a farm and realistic expectations of like the unpredictability of weather or the economy or things like that. So I think that affected my life view in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I'll popcorn it to Dalton and then he'll share his story. And Dalton, if you want to share yours, you can go now or we can go.
Yeah, no, I can definitely talk a little bit about my background as far as growing up. My mom was an English teacher and she also ran a daycare. And a big part of that daycare was doing book reports. And we would always have a different book to read and different reports to write. And I think that really shaped me becoming a journalist because, it was constantly fed into us, writing. And writing is a way to share your story. And I feel strongly that every single person out there has a unique story. And it's just, up to the people around them to bring out that story. And that's something that I try to do as a writer, is to try to bring out other people's stories. So I definitely put an emphasis on, people's backgrounds and stories, and I love to hear about them.
Awesome. And then if in your breakout group, someone else would ask Dalton a follow-up question and then they would go. Does that make sense, everybody? Like, yes. All right, cool.
Makes sense.
All right, then Lillian, if you want to kind of start sending people into breakout groups, we'll do that real quick.
Absolutely. I also put the instructions in the chat, so that was a super helpful demonstration, but if you need a little refresher, that's in there too. So I'm gonna set up some breakout groups really quickly.
So will it tell us how much time we have when we're in there?
We are gonna do 10 minutes, I think we decided, and I'll try to send out that little like countdown that Zoom does when we're wrapping it up. So
Okay,
about
perfect.
10 minutes.
And then when we come back, we're going to have at least one person from each group kind of report out, not about what people said in your group, but about the experience, something you took away from it, and then we'll have a discussion.
The rooms are
A response to recycling, my group, sorry.
We got cut off mid-sentence too, and we're like, what?
I gave you guys a few extra minutes too. I was trying my best.
That's okay. It was a really dramatic effect.
But also, like, it doesn't matter how much time you're given, you're always going to push up against it anyway. So,
Yeah.
Right. Like the secret of
fault.
life is.
yeah, exactly. It's like, we'll never know.
All right. So it looks like everyone is back. So I'm curious what your takeaways from the experience was. Was it easy to come up with questions to ask, to figure out what to include in your story? Did anything stand out to you about how your group members asked questions or how they told their story? If we could have at least one person from each group, we could have more than one person speak too. But at least one person kind of either raise their hand or unmute and share something that stood out to them.
Yeah, Caroline.
I was just amazed how everyone was doing really different work and has very different aims for being here. But it was also just really cool to hear everybody kind of dabbling in this same arena of like, there's got to be solutions out there, right? And I heard about Radically Rural from a friend, and we want to do what's working. And so the conversations, even though they were coming from very different places across the country and different types of work, like housing and economic development, and even just straight up wanting to storytell in like a rural setting, it was cool to hear that everyone kind of has that same buzz, right? Like this is going on, and I thought this might be the place.
Danielle, since you were the first one to share in our group, would you mind speaking out for us?
Sure. So similarly, I would say I thought our group was interesting, coming from many different backgrounds, and we were so geographically distributed that I don't know, that was a surprise to me because I was expecting, honestly, most people to be from New Hampshire or New England, and that was not the case. But I think everybody, had really interesting stories to share, and there was an abundance of follow-up questions that could have been asked as each person shared their story. Yeah, and I think that we're all just interested, too, in hearing more about the art of the interview.
Yeah, I noticed that too about the questions. I had in my mind that we would just kind of popcorn from person to person, but it ended up being like a group conversation, not like one person interviewing one person, which I think is a really good takeaway when we're talking about the art of the interview, is when it feels like, oh, I'm just getting to know you. Like questions come easily. We're asking each other questions. There's like an easy flow to it. So I agree with that, Danielle, of like questions came pretty easy.
Yeah, and I would add just quickly, it's cool to bounce off each other's questions. It's cool to listen to one person's question and then form your own based off that person's question. So I think it was really interesting just to hear, kind of like you said, just people just flowing and throwing questions out there. I thought that was really cool.
Andrea, did you have something to say? I saw you go off mute a couple times.
I did. Yeah, I think the things that I noticed were like little social cues that people did that I think helped enhance the interview. So like saying someone's name or acknowledging a question. You say like, oh, that's a great question. I think is it helps build that relationship, which I think really helps with the interviewing process.
I'm curious, thoughts about, so I tend to do this too much, and I'm curious if the folks who do this a lot have an opinion on how much the interviewer should tie in their own experience. So I think it can kind of help you to connect with people and can make it very human and personal and stuff. But if you do that too much, is it going to lead the conversation? Are you controlling the conversation too much or leading it in a place where it wouldn't have gone, and or dominating? Like how do you find that balance?
I could start because I was actually thinking about mentioning this a little bit later, but I'll mention it now. So I love to give at least a little bit about me when I start an interview, whether that's like, hey, I'm a reporter, I've been working at X publication for this amount of time, and giving them a little bit of background about who you are and why you're doing the story. That way you're giving them some information before you're asking them to give you any information. I think it's kind of a good trust building tool in any conversation, not just interviewing. But I was going to give an example. And Andrew's probably the only person that's going to know where this is. Andrew is a former coworker. Shout out, Andrew. But so Bridgeville, Delaware, I was there for a interview with a farmer. He owned a produce stand off the highway, and I was interviewing people about farmland preservation. And we were sitting at a picnic table outside, and we were sitting down, and I first started telling him about why I was doing this story. And I said, hey, yeah, I grew up on a farm. I have talked about farmland preservation with my dad a lot and about whether we're going to preserve our land. And here's why I'm interested in the topic. And you could just see like this guy in his 60s, maybe, just kind of like melt a little bit and be like, oh, so you get it. I think he actually said those exact words. When I told him I grew up on a farm, he said, oh, so you get it. And he felt like he could kind of take down these barriers, especially in farming. I think there's a lot of misconceptions sometimes about like what that life is like. And so he seemed like he could open up more. So that's to say, like, by giving a little bit about my background, I felt like, especially in that community, that people opened up a little bit more. Or even if you just say you're from Delaware, I'm sure, Andrew, you've experienced that, of like, people are very cautious of outsiders coming in and trying to report on their community. So if you can say, oh, I grew up in Greenville, like I know about whatever, they can tell you that you care about the community.
Yeah, I think it's easy for an interview to become an interrogation. And if you have ever been interviewed, like I just went through an interview, it can be absolutely terrifying, especially if you're not like I do this for a living. I do lots and lots of interviews, and then all of a sudden somebody's is like, hey, we want to interview you on TV. And immediately I'm thinking about, how do I sound smart? How do I be impressive? What do they want? Like, what kind of questions? All of these things. And so I think instead of defaulting to interview as interrogation, it's always better to look at interview as conversation. And Emily, what you said about letting down the guard, I've got 3 kids and I go back to Shrek. It's like people are like an onion. And so we're surrounded by this ego and, what people see on the surface. And I think it's our job as storytellers first, we have to get to the story. And in order to get to the story, we have to be good humans first. And that's how you peel that outer shell. And then Emily, like, well, I'm from Delaware, or I grew out of the front. Well, that's the next layer. And then that's the next layer. And that's how you really discover the heart of the story, by not looking at yourself as an interviewer first, but looking at yourself as a human first, and looking at that person across from you as a human first. And then you can meet in the magical middle. And I think that's really where the story is.
Yeah, I think that's important, because I think what you and Emily are kind of talking about is getting buy-in, before you start the interview. And there's various ways to do that, but if you don't do that, if you don't explain, here's why I'm sitting across from you and I'm going to ask you questions, or, here's who I am, that kind of stuff, people, you're not gonna be successful. And almost knowing that, being prepared for that when you go into the interview, of like, okay, this is how I need to frame this for the first 2 minutes of this conversation is really important, I think.
I love what you said, and I won't pop in again because I don't want to hog the microphone, but there's a really fantastic book called The Art of the Interview by Lawrence Grobel, and he used to write for Rolling Stone and things like that. And Randy, what you said reminded me of that, in that when he would go and interview famous musicians and things like that, he would hang out with them for like 4 days or a week or things like that. And sometimes you wouldn't really start doing the interview until the last hour of day 4, because it took 3 days to finally build enough of a rapport with that person to really get to the heart of the story. So I think some of it is, sometimes we're in too much of a rush and we look at interviews and stories as products, and, well, I've got 15 minutes to get this interview and now it's like a product, rather than an experience and a person and a human being. It's such a fantastic book, The Art of the Interview.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you all for your input to that question. It sort of reminds me a little bit too, and then I'll step back as well, about like perfectionist culture and like efficiency culture. Today, after the first track leader kickoff meeting we had of the year for Radically Rural, so all the folks that are planning the sessions for this year's summit, we had our kickoff meeting today, and I had one of the track leaders hang back so we could chat. And I expected it to be a few minutes, and it was almost an hour. And it was like, by the end, we just got to this amazing nugget that there's no way we could have done in a compressed period of time. But we're so much about maximizing our time that sometimes we don't allow that unraveling to happen naturally.
Yeah.
I think something that stood out when I think it was Phil was talking was and Randy too, is what makes you comfortable in an interview. If you are the person being interviewed, what makes you feel comfortable and like you can open up? A lot of people are uncomfortable talking about themselves. I joked to my group that my face was beet red when I joined because I get nervous sometimes talking about myself. So I guess that's an open question, and then we can move Dalton to some of the practical tips, and we can kind of keep that conversation going. But I'm curious if anyone wanted to chime in about what makes you comfortable in an interview, or confident.
I can say something. I honestly am not really sure if it really makes me comfortable, but I have a background in bartending, so I did that for about 3 years, and I mean, you're meeting new faces every night. So when I first started doing interviewing 2 years ago for a couple of features in the local newspaper, it was very, very like freaky for me. I didn't know what to do, what to say, how to talk. And then after I got a few of them in and done, I started to feel that kind of vibe of being a bartender again. And I just like would hang with it. And I guess in that mindset of trying to be open with any sort of questions, like I'll typically write down like 5 or 6 really basic, unless I can think of something that I really want to know, questions to pop the cork, I guess is the best way, and then see where the conversation flows. And at that point, I don't even have to think about it. The bartending stuff just takes over, and I'm like just gabbing on.
So practice, really, like
yeah.
You keep doing it, and you kind of get used to having a conversation. That's awesome.
As an interviewee,
Juliana.
oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as an interviewee, what really helps make me comfortable is knowing the questions ahead of time and, having a chance to get my thoughts, especially if I'm being recorded, if it's a podcast or an audio thing, I just like to have the time to put into coming up with good questions rather than feeling like I'm going to be exposed as an idiot because I can't be as conversational as I'd like to be at the time off the top of my head.
So that's why you throw my mode out of whack, because I go in with a list of questions that I've thought about and I get through about 2 of them because I'm coming up with, and it was kind of like what Phil talked about, that it's a conversation. I'll come in with 20 questions and I'll get through maybe 2 that were written down because I'm coming up with more questions as they talk. That's the unfortunate part about it. But I think if you've established that rapport, then they can also go with the flow as you veer in a different direction based upon what they've said.
Yeah. Well, I think even if you've given me some of those questions and I've got my head in the right space for the conversation, if you ask it a little differently, or, if it's not in order or whatever, that's okay. I don't necessarily want to read my responses. I just want to have thought it through first.
Yeah, feeling prepared on both sides of the interview makes a big difference. There's so I just shared a document with you all that has some practical tips that we compiled, and we can add to this. But at the bottom, there's a link of there's helpful links and resources And what you were talking about, Patty, about having questions in advance, I remember seeing that in this MLK 50 before you talk to a journalist guide. And it kind of outlines like things you can ask for, things that you can ask for and you might not get, which sometimes you can ask for questions ahead of time and you might not get them. But it kind of walks you through some things that might make you feel like you've done all the work on your end to feel prepared and confident when you go into that interview. But then I'll pass it on to Dalton, and we're going to walk through some of these tips and then open it up to you all to kind of add to it and build on this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And a huge part of the interview is what happens before the interview. So preparation is key. It could be considered the most important step of the interview. You want to learn about the individual or the group before the interview. You want to learn about what makes them special, what makes them unique, and just what makes them different. You want to practice your questions. Even if you're in the car driving to the interview, sometimes it helps just to vocalize those questions to yourself, just so you know that you're on point and that you sound good and that you can have confidence in your own self. I think that's the biggest thing about preparation, is that it builds confidence. Make sure you're in the right state of mind. Be ready for a back and forth, a positive one. And I think that's huge. Another huge step is asking the right questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question, but there's good questions and bad questions. So, you want to make sure that you have a general idea of what you want to ask. Ask a question that will enlighten, you and help organize your thinking. Make sure your question can be easily understood. This is something that I run into a lot. You're talking and sometimes it's not as easy to follow along as you hoped it'd be. So you want to make it efficient. Make sure your question asking is an efficient process. Ask questions that seek understanding rather than judgment. Go in with an open mind. Balance asking and telling. You don't want to tell the whole interview like we talked about, because you don't want to take the rails of the interview. You want to make sure that you're balanced and that you let that interviewee, tell their own story. Open-ended questions are good. Who, what, when, where, why, or how. Give the individual room to maneuver with their answers. While it's sometimes good to ask questions that lead to yes or no answers, they can also be detrimental, because if I ask a question and your answer is 3 words, it's hard for me to get some content out of that. So, try to avoid questions that are going to lead to yes or no, and listen and be deliberate. Silence is okay in an interview. Silence can be awkward, but you want to give the interview time to breathe. You don't want to be constantly talking yourself. Sometimes I'll find myself in a position where if I'm, working with somebody who maybe they're shy or maybe they're not used to being interviewed, they can be a little bit quiet, but you want to give them room, to develop their own answers. It's also important to ask the right follow-up question. And it's also important to practice empathy. Put yourself in their shoes. Also understand that your questions are a reflection of yourself. It's a reflection of your whole process. That goes to every point I just said, from preparation to asking the right question to open-ended questions, and listening and being deliberate. It's just important to understand that your questions are a reflection of yourself. And those are some tips that I put together.
Thanks,
Can
Dalton.
I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
absolutely.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so particularly from the standpoint of, if let's say we are new at interviewing people or just trying to, break the ice and become more efficient interviewers. I guess my question is, are there any practical tips for maybe not trying to bite off more than we can chew, and try to, let's say the interview isn't particularly going well, to sort of refocus it to elicit that story. I think there's a consensus on this call that we're trying to pull the story out of our interview subject. What advice, could you give to someone starting out, let's say, to do that? Let's say the interview goes off track, or the source is grumpy, or, arms are crossed, arms are folded, they don't really want to talk. Are there any redirection techniques that you found that work well in the past, or diverting their attention from, the tax increase for 2025, back to something else that's more palatable? What is the best way to break that ice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's always important to go into an interview with a set list of basic questions. Sometimes they can be really helpful. Like if I'm talking about somebody that just threw a big fundraiser for a nonprofit, I might ask something simple as, what was the atmosphere like in the building that night? That seems like a really basic, simple question, but that might open them up and they'll be like, oh yeah, I guess it was festive, it was, productive, it was successful, and all of a sudden their mind is flowing. So it's always good to have some basic follow-up, foundational questions before you get into your hard-hitting ones. And you always want to save your hard-hitting ones toward the end, just so you're not ambushing them. Because if you
Okay.
can lead them with some easy ones and get their confidence up, then you can ask the hard-hitting ones at the end, if that makes sense, I'd say.
Thank you.
I also, one of my flaws, maybe it depends on your perspective, in interviews is that I like to just let people talk, like especially maybe older folks that like to reminisce about the good old times and tell me, and it's my fault. I ask them about their life story, so they start telling me about their life story, and then I'm 45 minutes into this call and I'm like, I didn't get X, Y, and Z answered yet. So sometimes I need to say, okay, hey, like I've been having a great time talking to you, and we can follow up and talk more about this later, but I have to hop on another interview and I really need to know, like, I really wanted to find out this from you, and then try to get that question in that way. Sometimes I do have to like set my own deadlines, even if I don't have another interview, because I will let them talk forever. And that can help keep it focused as well. I don't know, does any other journalists on the call have tips along those lines or anything come to mind? Or non-journalists?
I was gonna say, I used to represent taxpayers before the IRS and state departments of revenue who had
Okay.
problems. And so I definitely had a really strong skill set of, you mentioned grumpy people, of trying to turn grumpy people around. And, oftentimes because mostly out of fear or frustration, they start out as more antagonistic. And and I'm not thinking of this from a journalist standpoint, because I know journalists have to remain pretty neutral, but I typically would find a way to put myself on their side somehow. Like, even if I didn't agree with everything they were saying, I would find one thing that I agreed with that they were saying and almost like be on their same trajectory, and it'd be like, that is so frustrating. I can't believe that happened, or, something like that. And then it's like, oh, you're not my enemy. You're on my side. We can talk about this together. And I don't know if this is just something that women and femme folks have to do, but I oftentimes have to make myself more palatable to people by, kind of letting them be alpha, if that makes sense. And sometimes that can put people more at ease and uncross the arms and stuff like that. Show where I'm lacking in knowledge. Like, I just don't know much about this. Could you help me learn more about that, or something like that?
The last thing you just said is probably one of my favorite questions to ask. I don't know much about this topic. Can you explain it to me so that I can explain it to other people? And I mean, that's probably, I'm seeing a lot of nodding from people in the Zoom room. It's probably one of the biggest jobs as a journalist is to break things down and explain it to them. And if you don't understand it, then you can't explain it. But I think that's a really good question to ask. And then you get people talking about things that they're interested in. I always tell people some of my favorite interviews are when you talk to like the meteorologist or the biological scientist or someone who like never gets to talk to reporters and is like, you want to know about what I study? And I'm like, yeah, I do. And then they get super excited to share it. So yeah, finding their interests or things that you can relate to.
That for a quick sec.
Yeah.
So I read Daniel Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People when I was like a little teenager. And one of the things that reminded me of was always like ask a favor of someone new to get them to like you, because when you need help and people are willing to give you that help, they'll like you more. So that's very along the lines of that, I think. Oh, can you please teach me? I don't really know this thing. and they kind of drops that wall, like I believe, I can't see her name, Juliana, I think, was saying earlier.
Jack, I think you unmuted yourself too. Jack is actually our community journalism track leader for Radically Rural. So he's putting together the journalism sessions this year, and he's with us today. Did you have something to contribute to?
Yeah, it was really along the lines, Juliana, of what you said and what Emily said there, to answer your question, Lon. I think it's people are more likely to answer or engage with your questions if they understand why you're asking them. And so, and I am a journalist, that's my background. So I've found it more effective to kind of go into an interview as like part of the preparation for the interview is knowing why I'm asking these questions. And then I can explain to the mayor or the police chief or whoever, like, I'm not asking this like to make you look bad or to smear you. I am asking because, we have people calling the newsroom and asking, or, we have, we know that this is something that people care about. Like, I am asking so that I can spread this understanding. And same thing, applies to what you were talking about, Emily. Like, if you're asking questions out of genuine curiosity of people who really know what they're talking about in a particular topic, they'll be a lot more excited and engaged to answer those questions.
Andrew had a really good question in the chat. How do you all feel about interrupting to get an interview back on track? It's something that also makes me uncomfortable. Sometimes I will just say, hey, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Can I clarify this? Or if you're going back to like clarify something or to, I don't know, maybe just kind of go back to a question that you had asked earlier. I don't think someone would be offended. I think often that's probably in our own head, but I'm curious what other people have to say because I would not say I'm an expert at that.
It can be really frustrating when you ask the question and somebody just doesn't stop talking. I like to keep an interview to a certain amount of time. I record my interviews, so I always have the time in front of me. It depends what the subject matter is, but for a lot of interviews, I would say 10 to 12 minutes, is efficient. But if somebody, over that time, you can only ask 2 questions because they won't stop talking, it can really throw you for a loop. So you want to make sure that you're assertive, and that you assert yourself. If they're talking and they don't seem to be, being productive with their answer, and you need to get the interview flowing, you can't hesitate to jump in and say, excuse me, that's incredible, but I'd also like to ask about this or that or X, Y, and Z. It's just important to be assertive because you don't want to be left with an interview that you didn't get what you needed out of it.
I think it also depends if you're in person, on phone, or over Zoom too. I don't know. I think Zoom almost kind of makes everything awkward anyway. So maybe it actually helps because you're always interrupting people by mistake. You're like, oh, it was the internet. Sorry. But it is kind of a hard thing to do.
I'm kind of curious, and it's a little bit of an observation, but I'm curious for a little conversation around it. But when I was in grad school, I had to do, for a research class, had to just go sit somewhere and observe. And then just write everything that I was observing, anything, just random note taking. And I'm a big picture thinker, so I often just glaze over the details. But so now I'm trying to become more disciplined and like listening for those nuggets that are different or interesting, right? So trying to be an astute listener and then diving into some detail that I've never heard about before, or that it would be a completely different angle than anybody would have thought of, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about anybody's techniques that way, or if you find that effective. But as a big picture kind of strategist thinker, my mind is all over the place when people are thinking, so I'm often not listening to every single detail. So
One thing I'll say, and hopefully this answers your question, is if you are sometimes thinking big picture and you miss something,
Right.
there's no harm in going back. I think it's something that I wish I had more confidence doing and just did every single time, because every time you call someone to clarify something, to ask a question and do a second conversation, you learn so much more. They've had time to think, they've had time to process their answers, and you've had time to process their answers. And so if you have that luxury of time, which you don't always do, but if you do and you have time to call that person back and ask, that is awesome. That's really helpful.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something real quickly. You know, I mentioned in my breakout group number 1 that I'm not a journalist. I'm not really an interviewer. But as I'm listening to everyone talk about interview techniques, I've changed my mind. I am an interviewer because, and my wife's on the call as well. And we've spent most of our career in business development, sales and marketing, account management, things of that nature. And yes, to make money in those arts, you need to get very good at relating with people, empathizing, and asking questions. And one of the things, and I forget, oh, Dawn, North Dakota. I just, when you asked a question, made me think of something. I wanted to circle back. I remember a book from the 70s called Spin Selling, terrible name, because if you're not in sales, you may not pick it up. And it was a process. SPIN is an acronym for situation, like problem analysis, implication, and needs payoff. And I wonder, you know, not that in journalism we would take a system, if you will, a 4-step system, but, you know, maybe for, you know, the Daltons of the world that are experienced interviewers and can weave questions and listen to the answers into real stories. My hunch is you've almost written the story even by the time the interview is done. Like what are the cues that you're waiting for? Like, do you just let them happen? Do you direct it? Like, I'm thinking, like, when you tell a story, you talk about the situation, you talk about the characters, you talk about the conflict, you know, man versus nature, man versus self, you know, and all of that leading out to a conflict and then a conclusion. Like, is there anything that, again, you know, there's a wide range of journalists on this call. Like, what are the fundamentals of those components? Like, is there a system or a flow to how you might write an interview, or do we just go back to 1A, be prepared?
Yeah, I would definitely say it's important to let the conversation come naturally. You know, I definitely try not to lead it too much, but sometimes you do need to lead it a little bit. Yeah, so that's kind of how I would answer that. You know, a little bit. And I just wanted to say that, you know, the interview process, it goes beyond journalism. You know, if you're hiring somebody to, you know, to paint your house or to mow your lawn, you're going to ask them questions. You know, have you done this before? What are your, you know, qualifications, blah, blah, blah. So I think it's just important. Interviewing is something that goes beyond journalism and is really prevalent in daily life.
Yeah, Lon, that was a great transition into what we wanted to kind of tie this up with, which you said it. You didn't think you were an interviewer. You didn't think you had experience in that. And then as we talked about this, we're like, wait, I do have experience in this. And I think that was kind of our idea with that first breakout group session too, was think about ways that you use these skills every day, whether you're a journalist or not. And by asking questions of your community and the people in your community, you learn more about them and you're more likely to invest in that community. And so we wanted you all to kind of go away thinking about how interviewing might play into going to public meetings, to interviewing your babysitter, the person that mows your lawn, or going to the farmer's market and talking to the vendor who... This happened to me the other week. I get hot cider from the vendor every week. And for the first time, I asked her, like, what's your connection to the farm? And then you actually learn about the people in your community, the small businesses. And by sharing their stories, it's like supporting the whole network. And I think it goes back to someone shouted in the group chat, empathy. I think it all kind of goes back to that.
Well, thank you so, so very much for your time today. And I feel like we could have kept going, there's just so much collective wisdom to share. And I will say another benefit, I think, of learning to engage with folks in conversation and throughout your day, is this idea of strengthening the social fabric in general. And if you think of all of us being held by the social fabric, it doesn't matter what industry we're in, what state we're in. That is so important. And that's actually, first to hear it here, is the theme of Radically Rural for this year, is weaving together the social fabric. And so there's going to be a lot of really, I don't have a catchy name for it yet, but there's going to be a lot of kind of ideas and conversations and practical hard skills to come out of that as well. So I feel like this is the perfect group to be there for that. So I hope you all can join us September 25th and 26th here in Keene. And tickets are available now. It's sliding scale, so anywhere from free to what you can afford. And we'd just love to have you here. So thank you to Emily and to Dalton. Thank you to each of you for your engagement. And I hope that we see you in future roundtables as well. Please fill out the survey that's going to come out afterwards so we can know what to do better. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great
Thanks,
day.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, I'm writing notes.
That's great.